Hello, welcome to Minnesota Republican Roundtable. I'm your host, Jennifer Zielinski, and we just got through the Minnesota 2023 tumultuous legislative session. Just about over a month ago, we had the runaway Democrats push through progressive legislation right through the two houses and right to our governor's desk. And we're going to see some of those effects in Minnesota come to fruition here soon, and long-term effects. With us today to talk about it, Representative Mike Wiener. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Out of your district, I know, but welcome down to this area, the Twin Cities, and
It's a little out of my district, but understand this is the battleground, so to speak. You know, if we want to take Minnesota back, we need to get the metro and we need to get the suburbs voting the right way.
Exactly. Representative Mike Wiener, tell us about yourself, first of all.
Sure. I live up in Long Prairie. I grew up there, born and raised there. I met my wife in St. Cloud, and we moved back to Long Prairie and started our family there and own a small business. We have 9 kids together, and still raise a few beef cows. And you know, people say, well, where's your district? And I say, it's not quite heaven, but you can see it from there. It's basically the heart of the state. It's the center of the state. Todd County, Wadena, a little bit of Morrison and Cass. So a lot of agriculture in our area, some manufacturing, some processing, but ag is probably the biggest employer of our area.
Yep, when I was looking at a map, I saw it was like the heart of Minnesota, which I'd like to say every city's the heart of Minnesota, but I definitely was in the middle.
I think geographically we have it. I think if you measure Minnesota, north and south, east and west, I believe there's a spot in Todd County which is actually the center of the state. At least that's what I've been told. I've never checked it, but that's what I've been told.
Very cool. Well, politics wasn't your main goal in life. You never saw yourself running, but what got you into the Minnesota legislature?
You know, it's interesting. I always voted. I mean, since I was 18, I always voted. My folks were very, very conservative, and I grew up. And at that time, rural Minnesota was pretty Democrat. You know, so our family was kind of the odd duck, so to speak, when we would put up conservative signs or Republican signs when all your neighbors are putting up Democrat signs. But now, greater Minnesota really has switched. It's not so much Republican anymore. Not so much Democrat anymore, it's Republican. So we live in this area, and this last election cycle is 76% voted Republican in our area. And it's true, I didn't plan on running. My wife and I both wanted to get involved, and with our kids, we're really looking at the future and saying, if we want to have a future for our kids, we have to get involved, we have to have our voices be heard. So all we wanted to do was become delegates. That was our goal. And went to the February 2nd caucuses and, you know, went through the process, just wanted to learn, and we wanted to have our voice. Well, with redistricting, we had no sitting representative. So I looked at my wife and I said, I think I'm gonna run. And she said, are you serious? I said, as a heart attack. She goes, what's your chances of winning? I said, not a hope in heck. I didn't think I did, you know, because I'd never run before. I didn't know the process, procedure, but I thought I'm going to at least get my name out there, you know, get some exposure, figure out how things work. So signed up, went to the convention, ended up with the endorsement, which was kind of a shock in some ways, but and then I was primaried by one of the other candidates, and for our area, we spent more money fighting against each other than we really should have. And I look at that and wasted resources like that, that's really a detriment to our party. We've got to come up with better ways rather than fight amongst ourselves.
Yes.
We have to unify, and I kind of compare it to the Braveheart movie when we say, you know, unite the clans. Instead of fighting amongst ourselves, we need to work together.
You know, we saw that in the 2018 election, the primary between Johnson and Pawlenty, unfortunately. It just became that fighting between them that almost took the focus out of the actual election.
Absolutely. So I wasn't really involved in 2018, but through this process, and I like numbers. Numbers make sense to me. So I did some just calculation and looked at how much money we spent in the House campaigning against each other. On the Republican side, I figure between 750 with outside of money, about $1.3 million we spent fighting amongst ourselves. Now that's $1.3 million we could have spent on the governor's race or getting a statewide candidate across the finish line. Instead, we spent that fighting amongst ourselves. And we can't afford to do that. And the Democrats can outspend us 8-10 to 1.
Yep.
Every dollar that we waste against each other is resources that we just squander. We can't do that moving forward. We have to, like I said, unite the clans and start working together instead of against each other.
Yep. Now, small business is really your focus, it's your passion because it's where you've come from. Tell us first about small businesses. Why are they important in Minnesota?
Sure. Well, my history, my dad was a small business owner. In our area, with ag being the biggest, industry out there, he put up grain bins, steel buildings, a lot of flat work. And I come from a big family, so there was 7 of us boys, and I got 3 sisters. We worked for Dad growing up. So we saw the benefits of the small business. And those lessons that I learned from Dad, and I probably didn't do a good enough job listening as much as I should have, but he had some really good points that stuck with me for years. And a prime example would be during the fall, when the farmers harvest their grain, it goes into the grain bins. And you hear these corn dryers running. If you're ever out in the fall in greater Minnesota, you hear this loud hum when you go around these farms. And I don't like loud noises. But I remember going to a farm with Dad one time and saying, that noise just bothers me. I hate that loud noise. And he said, that's a good noise. So what do you mean? He said, that means that there's grain in the bin. And if there wasn't that noise, that would mean that there's no grain in the bin. And that trickles down, he said, because when the farmers do good, we all do good. And that's really greater Minnesota, but not just greater Minnesota, but the whole state. Minneapolis and St. Paul don't live in a vacuum. The products that come down to General Mills and the manufacturing outlets, the lumber, grains, all of this stuff comes from greater Minnesota, or a lot of it does. So the one Minnesota that was promoted by our governor in the last election cycle, there's a lot of truth to it. Unfortunately, it wasn't followed through in practice when it came to legislation this year.
And we're seeing it fall apart.
Exactly. So small business is huge. In Minnesota, in the United States, Small Business Administration says that anything under 500 employees is a small business.
Okay.
And I believe there's about 90% of the employees, 90+% of employees across the United States are employed by a small business. 33 million, I think, employees. That's huge. Small businesses in the United States from 20 to 21 created about 8.7 million new jobs. So our economic drivers are really small businesses. And we saw that a lot during COVID as well. With the lockdowns and so forth, we had people who said, I want to try something else. I want to do something else. And they started their own businesses. But small businesses can be a struggle. 20% of small businesses fail in the first year. By the time they hit the 5-year mark, almost 50% or over fail. And by that 10-year mark, it's only about 25%, I think, actually make it. So it's a small percentage. But we always have more small businesses that want to come up. And this is part of the greatness of our nation.
Yeah.
It's always striving to do better. And we want to try. We're entrepreneurs, Go back to our founding fathers and look west, young man. We always wanted the opportunity. And I think it's something that's deeply ingrained in us to strive, to build, to do something. And unfortunately, what happens is our biggest obstacle sometimes is our own government, putting rules and regulations and more taxes. And when government controls the means of production, that is socialism. And we saw a lot of that this year. So
it got scary what they're pushing through, what they're trying to take control of in the legislature, just everything, we saw from the abortion bill to the trans bill. But now we're going to see taxes that are really going to affect how business is done in Minnesota. It sounds like they even gave a tax break to the film industry.
Absolutely. That was one of the bills that was an incentive to bring more film to northern Minnesota. And in order to incentivize those businesses to come in, they were going to get a tax break. So the bill author knows that if you want to bring business into Minnesota, you have to cut taxes.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, when it came to the larger portion of the legislation, we added taxes to Minnesota. You know, that's not the way to incentivize more business growth. You know, it is just, we've learned these lessons in the past, and unfortunately, we don't remember them. If you go back a few years, you look at, you know, like Margaret Thatcher, and I just watched a thing with her the other day talking about the dangers of socialism. Now, she was a pretty smart gal.
Yes.
Really was. And she talked about how when government is dictating to businesses what they can and can't do and the means of production, and how that just hurdles and obstacles that are placed in there, that's a dangerous situation. And with our government, with our people, we've gotten away from government being the problem. I mean, Ronald Reagan talked about it. He said government isn't the solution, it's the problem.
Yep.
We've gotten away from that mindset. We've gotten away from that Margaret Thatcher mindset where socialism and government control is a bad thing, and we really need to relearn those lessons. Unfortunately, our human nature is what it is. We have a short recollection and a short memory, so
we saw that during, unfortunately, 2020 with COVID, where people looked to the government to take control and shut businesses down for a couple weeks. But you don't have small businesses that can usually take that, or a restaurant, small family restaurant.
You know, when it came to greater Minnesota, those businesses and stuff, they took a very serious hit when lockdown. I like numbers. Numbers make sense to me. I very quickly said, let's look at contact with people. You know, out in our area in Todd County, 25,000 people, you have contact with most of them. You're going to see, you know, single digits to maybe 50 people on an ordinary day. Now you take that contact level and compare it down here to the metro. You know, the chances of getting sick out in greater Minnesota from COVID, your numbers were so small.
Yes.
So therefore the lockdowns to me were not justified at all.
Not
it didn't
at a
make sense.
Statewide level at all.
Right. So it was pretty obvious out in greater Minnesota that, you know, if you wanted to wear a mask and you wanted to take the precautions, go right ahead. You know, that's up to you. But I don't think it was the scare that it was down here in the metro.
Exactly. Now, we saw something that made it through the Minnesota legislative session, the Family Leave Act. You know, on the outset, it looks good. It looks something like Republicans should be supporting because, hey, you can build your family while still maintaining your job. But this isn't going to be good for the small business owner.
There again, we wanted some concessions, some amendments to that bill, if nothing else. Give the small businesses a chance to grow. You know, instead of that 50 employees or 100 employees, the state generally says 50 employees and under is a small business. But now for this, it went down to 1 employee. Out in greater Minnesota, growth of businesses is pretty organic.
Yes.
So a prime example would be if you're working a job maybe in town, maybe it's at a lumberyard or a manufacturing place or something like that, but you're a good welder, you know, so you've got your garage and you weld and you fix things. Well, pretty soon a neighbor will say, hey, can you fix this for me? Next thing you know, that sideline becomes a business. So that growth is there. Then what happens as that business grows? Who do you employ? It's going to be a relative or a friend or your kids, something to this effect. So with the family medical leave, when it's down to 1 employee, it doesn't make sense in a lot of cases. Those employers take care of them because they're family. Like I said, they're friends. And when you run a small business out in greater Minnesota, everybody is going to know what kind of employer you are. You know, I said my dad owned his own business. Years later, I ran into a gentleman. after my dad died, I'm sorry. And he said, I worked for your dad years ago. And I said, I didn't know that, So we started talking, and he said, almost everybody tried to go work for your dad after high school because he was a good employer. They did construction. They worked hard. As the business grew, more of us boys started working there, but it was neighbors, it was friends, it was relatives, and they all tried to go work because when you had a good name as an employer, you took care of your employees. That's the way it works out in Greater Minnesota, and that's the way it really works in the metro as well. But when government starts dictating what you can and can't do, we end up having more problems, and it really stifles the growth, the entrepreneurship of those small businesses. And that's really what concerns me is in economic development, one of the committees I'm on, we talked more and more about multi-generational wealth.
Yes.
And helping out BIPOC communities. So on the one hand, we want to invest more money to start that growth, that entrepreneurship. And at the same time, we're creating more and more hurdles for them moving forward, like the family medical leave.
Yep.
The paperwork alone for a lot of the regulations and so forth almost dictate you got to have another employee. And when you're just starting out, that's really tough sometimes.
And it sounds like there were private ways to accomplish the Family Medical Leave Act without making it a problem for small businesses, without making it a hurdle.
Absolutely. There is private options out there. They were discussed and talked about. You could buy into that. Something like 80% of businesses offer family medical leave already. So we're talking about a small portion, 20%. Now, I don't know the breakdown if that's big businesses or small businesses, but there's another interesting number. Somewhere in the vicinity of 780 million hours of vacation time do not get used in the United States on a typical year.
I believe that.
That's huge.
Yes.
But what does that tell you about people in our country? We're workers.
We are.
That's right. We work hard, and if we don't even use our own vacation, what does that tell you? So the reasons for the family medical leave, and we hear the negative, we hear the stories about somebody that really dealt with a hardship or struggle. Those could have been dealt with in a private setting.
Yep.
Instead of mandating, and now the growth of government that goes with that. Now we've got to have another government department, more full-time employees, or FTEs as they're called, and more tax dollar that's going to have to get pulled from the population in order to run that department. And that's something that we saw this year. I believe 3M was the largest employer in Minnesota for a number of years. With the full-time employees that we're going to be adding after this last legislative session, I've been told, and I haven't checked it out yet, but I believe it's accurate, that the state will be the largest employer. That is scary.
That is ridiculous and scary at the same time.
Any business that ends up being top-heavy, management-heavy, collapses, almost always. It's a guarantee. Here we are in the state of Minnesota, adding more and more government employees, and in order to pay them, you have to raise revenue in order to do that.
And that's not done through magical and imagination. It's done through taxes.
Exactly. And there was statements that said, we cut a historic amount of taxes cut this year. There's some truth to that, and I question it, because how can we have two things being this truthful but exactly opposite? There was tax cuts made, but there was also what they considered revenue raisers, which means tax increases, somewhere to the tune of about $10 billion.
Yes.
So we cut taxes, but we're also raising taxes. And I think one legislator put it the best. He said, you're cutting taxes that's coming out of one pocket and you're pulling the taxes out of another.
Exactly.
Which is exactly right. So in the state of Minnesota this year, we had this $19.5 billion surplus, which is just an astronomical number.
It's ridiculous that we have that. They're doing kind of the right thing, but it's ridiculous that we have that to begin with.
Right. So you look at that number, and where does that number come from? About half of it came from one-time, almost all of it came from one-time revenue. So, it's government money that came from the federal government. Sales tax in in Minnesota is a big part of that as well. We're not going to see that ongoing. So that $19.5 billion, and I kind of compare this to the lottery. I like to break things down where people can, it's a simple way of looking at it. November 8th, 2022, the Democrats basically won the lottery.
Yes.
They had a $19.5 billion lottery check there. Unfortunately, what happens with the vast majority of lottery winners? They go bankrupt.
Yes.
It's a high percentage, 70-some% go bankrupt. We're doing that in the state of Minnesota. We took that $19.5 billion surplus. It's being spent on long-term government growth, more departments, more employees, more offices, and that's going to have to get paid for on the backs of the taxpayers. When we're already dealing with high taxes, I think Minnesota is the fourth highest tax state now in the nation. We're going to be driving more and more producers out of the state.
And that's what I get afraid of. You talked about briefly when we were before on here, we're losing our agriculture business. I mean, we're losing greater Minnesota. Dairy farms, even in your district, are disappearing.
Sure, and we've seen that. Some of that is the larger dairies that get built up and so forth. But we're also seeing regulation that stifles the growth of agriculture. There's an area in South Dakota they call the dairy corridor now because we've overregulated the dairies in our area, and the new large dairies are going to South Dakota because they have less restrictions, less regulations they have to deal with. It's more economical for them to be in South Dakota. So we see product that goes from like bedding product that gets sent from central Minnesota all the way out to South Dakota. It's interesting. We're driving business out of our area. It's not sustainable. We cannot keep growing or going that way in our state. And it's kind of scary. What will happen in the future? We've already seen with the census, I think there's close to 20,000 people had left the state. And there was adjusted gross income in the state of Minnesota. We lost about $1.5 billion of adjusted gross income in the state. That's producers, that's businesses that are leaving, have left already. Compare that to Wisconsin, who right next door, pretty similar to our area, by demographic, size, everything else, they lost about 60 million. With the new legislation that we put in place, there was an article, I think, from a business owner or a former business owner that was in the Star and Tribune talking about leaving the state. Because of the environment that that the legislation passed this year is going to make worse in our state. But I do believe it's not all gloom and doom.
Yep, and I want to get into that. How can our viewers start to turn the tides and help turn the tides and look to a better future in Minnesota?
Well, I think there's like a backlash a lot
Yes.
of times when things go too far. You have people that say, we're not going to go down that road. I think we have a great opportunity in the state of Minnesota to point out the problems with this last session's legislation. And instead of people leaving the state, we can win. If you look at the numbers, the Republicans only lost the House by 4 races.
Yes.
Less than 1,500 votes total for those 4 races. In the Senate, 1 seat, less than 500 votes. So the balance of power in the state of Minnesota was decided by less than 2,000 voters in the state. This is not a heavily blue state at all.
No, it isn't.
We have to give the voters the reasons why to vote Republican. Why should get involved? We have to be better organized. We have to work together. One of the programs that I've been promoting is Adopt a Rep, where, someone like myself who's in a heavily red district, we would work with a representative that's running in an area close to us that's a contentious seat. Maybe it's in the suburbs, maybe it's St. Cloud, maybe it's Duluth or the Iron Range or up in Fargo. But those reps, the senators, the BPOUs, can all adopt the rep candidate. So, financially help them out, door knocking, lit drop, whatever it takes to flip those seats. But then we have to give these voters reasons to vote Republican.
Yes.
Why do we want to stay here in Minnesota, and how do we have a great state. We really do. We have just not been active enough in promoting our ideas and why they work. Lower taxes works. Less government control works. Our education right now is a challenge, and we're seeing across the state of Minnesota, people are not happy with what's happened, dictates from the state of what's going to the education. And the tax levies that are going to be placed against the independent school districts across the state, they have the potential to bankrupt some of these school districts.
And now that changes to government-run school, and we see an education that fails everybody, and especially those, we've seen such a gap with education among white and BIPOC even, that we need to fix that. Not give a leg, give a hand up, but give that hand up so everyone has equal footing.
I mean, don't we want to see everyone succeed?
Yes.
And everyone get a good education?
Yeah.
So I like history, and if you go back, in greater Minnesota, we used to have the Little Red schoolhouses or the township schoolhouses. And one of the reasons that they were talked about getting away from them is because there were certain areas that, through economics or demographics or whatever the reason was, couldn't hit the standards as far as education.
Okay.
So here, about 70 years later, aren't we dealing with the same thing?
Same thing.
So how well has this system really worked? I mean, we really got to do some soul searching here and say, is the system that we're working on with now the best system that we have? We saw the challenges during COVID.
Exactly.
And more parents opened up their eyes and said, are my kids learning what they're supposed to be learning? And charter schools, homeschools, different options for students have just exploded across the state and across the nation.
Exactly. So making people aware of that, and also getting involved not only with your local race, but other races, we can change that. Representative Mike Wiener, it's been a pleasure for you to come on this show. You wealth of knowledge, and I know we could talk for a couple hours here.
Well, that was a quick half hour. I thought didn't hit a lot of the topics I wanted to talk about, but thank you very much for having me on. I enjoyed this.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you for joining us at Republican Roundtable. This is Jennifer Zielinski, and I'll see you next time.